Thank you very much for joining us at this panel discussion, and I am going to hand straight over to Professor Anya Hulbert, who will be leading today's event.
Thank you, Lucy, and welcome to everybody. It's really wonderful to connect with so many alumni from all around the world. This is our first virtual alumni event, and I think it's been a really fascinating and invigorating day thus far. And thank you especially to Sophie McDermott for leading her first convocation as chair. It's really exciting to be part of Newcastle University's initiative. Lots of initiatives in meeting global challenges. And we've all been really focused in the last sort of 9 months on the global pandemic, but we haven't lost sight of the challenge of climate change. I think some of the positive unintended consequences of the pandemic have been beneficial for the climate change challenge. The improvement in urban air quality, the reduction in carbon emissions, our increased focus on nature. But the challenge to reach our global society's goals for decarbonization and figuring out how best to get there, those challenges still remain, and they remain top of the priority list for this university. It's also clear from the large take-up for this event that many of you recognize the importance of this challenge. So it's really exciting to have our expert panel with us today, alumni and staff of Newcastle University, to speak from their deep experience on policy, practice, and delivery of solutions to this challenge. And we have Professor Phil Blythe, Dr. Catherine Rettig, Madeline Rollins, and Dr. Marcus Richards with us today. And I'll say a little bit more about each one as we go along. So we'll go from policy at the top to engineering delivery of solutions on the ground. And before we start the discussion, I'd just like to lay out a few guidelines to let you know how it'll go. First thing I've been asked to ask you is just, if possible, if you could rename yourself with your full name so that we know who you are, and so that Zoom records exactly who you are. And you can do that by clicking on the little 3 dots and dropping in the drop-down menu, finding rename, and then rename yourself with your full name. That'd be really helpful. Thanks. So the way this will go is that each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes, setting out their views, and then we'll turn to you at the end of all those brief talks for a live Q&A. So if you can just type your questions into the chat, Ria Snowden will be monitoring them, she'll collate them, and then I'll read them out, and I'll direct them to individual panelists if you say you want a particular person to answer it. Otherwise, I'll just open it up to all. And if I could ask if you could just keep yourself muted and your video switched off during the talks to make it the best experience for everybody so that it goes smoothly. Just to say, the whole panel discussion is being recorded and it'll be available after this day concludes. So I would like to introduce our first speaker now. I'm really delighted to introduce Dr. Catherine Rettig. She's a senior lecturer in international politics and the British Academy Wolfson Fellow. She's in the School of Geography, Politics, and Sociology here. Her research focuses on governance and policymaking in the transition to low carbon economies and on using AI to make climate smart cities. She's an active participant in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations. So I'll hand over to Catherine now.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So we're in the midst of a climate crisis in addition, and still happening as the COVID crisis is evolving and is starting to get worse again. So, but not to forget, the climate crisis has become an existential threat to our societies and to our economies. We see an increasing number and intensity of climate disasters, such as wildfires in California, droughts across Africa, floods and hurricanes, some of them most recently even hitting Ireland and the UK, if you remember, last year. And this brings an increase in mass migration and a lot of migration pressures all across the world, often from developing countries to developed countries. And it's amazing, but important to remember, the 5 warmest years since 1880 have occurred in the last 5 years, from 2015 to 2019. So the international community has actually been successful in, well, not solving climate change, but at least agreeing on a framework that gives us a fighting chance to do that. So the Paris Agreement in 2015, the global international community agreed the Paris Agreement that for the first time also includes emission reductions for developing countries and especially emerging economies. It sets a 1.5 degree to 2 degrees Celsius target of warming in response to the plight also of small island states and countries with low-lying populated areas to not sacrifice them as sea levels rise in the original 2 degree Celsius target scenarios. And as of 2019, the observed global temperature change is already in the range of 0.8 to 1.2 degrees Celsius. So it is very safe to say time is running out. So meeting the Paris targets requires decarbonization of economies by or before 2050. We need to move towards net negative emissions, especially in terms of compensating remaining emissions with carbon sinks, especially trees and green vegetation. And for most countries, this means that they need to hit interim targets of reducing emissions by 50% within the next 10 years, so by 2030. And meeting these targets really requires major shifts to the economy and large-scale investments, and especially also increased recognition by governments of the crucial role that is played by cities, businesses, and civil societies. So I'm now sharing the screen to show you a graph. So what we see is, pick the European Union as an example. The UK and many other countries are working towards similar emission scenario targets of actually achieving net zero or carbon neutrality, which has become the new buzzword in the last year or so. And the idea is really that by 2050, emissions have gone. There will be remaining emissions, especially around agriculture and some transport sectors, but those need to be compensated, especially in terms of land use and forestry, so natural carbon sinks, and also artificial carbon sinks, potentially around carbon removal technologies.
And also there was supposed to be like a full.
And most of the sectors in terms of residential areas, but especially industry, power, everything which is around electricity generation, will really need to become carbon neutral, especially within the next 30 years for certain, but especially most of the investment having to happen in the next 10 to 20 years. So, sorry. So what does this mean in terms of implementing the Paris Agreement through national policies? In the Paris Agreement, they're called nationally determined contributions. So policy measures really have to move towards net zero carbon emissions, and that means that they have to be socially inclusive. They need to focus on economic co-benefits such as green jobs, zero carbon investment in infrastructure and technologies. They also need to be based, and this is quite important, on reliable cross-party consensuses to ensure trust in long-term investments for transport and energy infrastructure. We're talking about 10, 20, 50-year investment cycles here, with usually a lot of government changes from right wing to left wing to moderate governments in any country over that kind of time period. So the environmental, social, and economic costs of carbon emissions really need to be also reflected in prices, and especially fossil fuel subsidies will have to be phased out as soon as possible. There are a number of different policy instruments, and we're most likely looking at some kind of policy mix of those across any country. the most still important one, probably 70 to 90% part of the mix in any country, are command and control regulations. And this means setting rules that are backed up by monitoring and enforcement mechanisms, as governments essentially command the regulated parties, everyone living or being active in a country's jurisdiction, to behave in a certain way by setting, for example, emission standards for air pollutants, product standards, mandating the use of specific technologies, or also setting up, for example, low emission zones in cities. Increasingly important are becoming market-based instruments that put a price on carbon emissions, so the polluter has to pay, and that will have to be factored into companies' operations through emission trading, for example, the European Emission Trading Scheme, and also subsidies for different kinds of technologies, and especially taxes. And the third and mostly increasing one are voluntary agreements, especially in the form of public-private or private partnerships, and industry set standards. And those tend to allow more flexible approaches and leveraging the resources of non-state actors such as companies and cities, but they also run the risk of, well, sometimes deteriorating into essentially greenwash and PR campaigns with an actual limited effectiveness. So to improve their effectiveness, this means requiring monitoring by third-party verification through independent organizations. One example is the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, and different environmental NGOs. And it's important to keep in mind that all of those policies need to be stable over a longer time period. They need to be integrated across different policy areas, and they need to be coherent, that they're not contradicting each other. And especially in the last 10 or so years, we've seen a strong role for new technologies, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and smart applications. And there is a strong potential that part of this emission gap between the 1.5-degree target and the current warming trajectory, which is much closer to a 3 to even 4-degree trajectory, can be reduced with new technologies like artificial intelligence applications. And those are becoming widely available and also financially competitive compared to fossil fuel alternatives. Artificial intelligence is especially becoming a game changer for scaling up the uptake of low carbon technologies and also generating economic growth. And the UK has been taking on, well, certainly in terms of ambition and also increasingly in terms of delivery, a leadership role on this. But it's important to remember that those technologies, the promises are great, but we really have to be aware and careful about the related risks to them. They carry challenges, especially for social cohesion in terms of employment, privacy, cybersecurity, and also potential unintended outcomes for democracy. So we need very responsible policies that minimize those risks, especially with regards to personal data protection, privacy, cybersecurity, and also social policies around education so that people can actually benefit from the advantages of those new technologies. And a very important part, which sometimes tends to be overlooked, is maintaining public support by ensuring socially inclusive transitions towards, especially now with the COVID pandemic, having a large number of negative effects on the social end. We need to recognize and accept that there will be losers of the transition. People who are working in fossil fuel relevant sectors such as the oil, gas, or coal and extraction industries, fossil fuel power plants, agriculture, and so on. And those often include low-skilled jobs and higher or high-skilled jobs. We will also see a lot of stranded assets as investments around fossil fuel will have to be increasingly divested, with effects on also people's pensions, which tend to be invested via large institutional investors in those areas. So to maintain overall public support and avoid resentment that could be capitalized by populist movements and parties into anti-climate action movements and votes, we've recently seen that in the US and in Brazil, it will be crucial that the users are being compensated. And this means investment into education, public infrastructure, and especially low and zero carbon industries in cities, and not to forget rural areas, which will be negatively affected by this transition. So to conclude, transitioning to low carbon economies provides a wealth of benefits, while there are also inevitable challenges that need to be addressed to maintain public support in this especially socially inclusive transition. We need to take a holistic approach that is based on the sustainable development goals and especially international cooperation and mutual learning from each other's and especially other countries' successes is crucial, and in terms of building capacities to further improve and avoid reinventing the wheel. And countries can, in fact, ensure successful COVID-19 recoveries through those low or zero carbon economic transitions and the necessary policy stability by embedding climate policies across different sectors, building resilience to financial, economic, health, political related crises, and especially to incentivize non-state actor contributions like businesses and cities, and especially by adhering to ambitious long-term targets towards 2050 and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was a really comprehensive overview of the different considerations with respect to policy and implementation and achieving goals. I'd now like to turn to Dr. Marcus Richards. He's an executive advisor at the Boston Consulting Group to the oil and gas industry. Marcus graduated from Newcastle with a BSc in geology in 1979. He also holds a PhD in sedimentology from Swansea University. He spent time at Wharton, Stanford, and Harvard Business Schools. And he was an executive with BP and Dana Petroleum. So he knows the energy sector inside and out. So over to you, Marcus.
Many thanks, Anya. I'm going to build on a number of things that Catherine has said. And I want to start with the first point, which is there isn't a silver bullet here. And in order to address climate change, and that's a reality because the solution that we need is actually about linking science and technology, about economics and politics, as well as addressing some of the ethical and I think the moral questions that come out of our cultural behavior in terms of the way that we make and conserve and consume energy. Now, there's normally two paths that people think about. The first one is adapting to climate change, because the reality is that whatever interventions we put in place now are going to take time to have an effect. I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on the second piece, which is really around greenhouse gas emissions and improving our ability to capture greenhouse gas emissions, whether that be carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, or methane. And those last two, by the way, are way more potent than CO2. Now, if we go straight to the issue of fossil fuels, because I think that's where we do need to go. If you look at the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions today, they're in three main areas. First one is transportation in all its forms. The second one is in electricity generation. And the third one is in changes in land use, such as agriculture and deforestation. So basically, fossil fuels has played a major role in 2 out of the 3 drivers for climate change. So what I want to do is offer up 6 steps as a way forward, which really cover a baseline around the energy mix, from policy and energy transparency, which is what Catherine was starting to talk about, to emerging energy options, and then also how we might fund the journey, which is a big issue. So the first step is energy transparency and funding policies. Now, what does that mean? As Catherine has said, it's about designing integrated solutions that recognize the impact and the consequences of the choices that we make. I want to give a couple of examples. The first one is really electric vehicles. So that's it's a policy that a lot of people have introduced in different countries, and there's no doubt that they will reduce local air pollution and emissions from traffic. But we've also got to address the global decarbonisation of the power sector that provides the electricity. Otherwise, this is not going to solve the real problem. And then finally, we also have to put in the electric vehicle charging infrastructure beyond cities to include towns and rural areas where in the main investments may not deliver economic returns for investors. The second one I'm sure will be of interest, which is the issue of social media. So it's the mainstay of our society, but we do have to realize that to to meet the global desire to be globally connected with social media in terms of digital devices, the internet, that has actually accounted for a growth in energy demand, and it now represents 10% of all global energy. And it's about to increase. So by 2030, 23% of the electricity demand is going to come from social media, and that doesn't include 5G. So there's very little conversation around this. And what we also need to recognize is that many of the electricity sources for that social media, particularly the cloud computing and server farms, comes from fossil fuels. So that's the first step. The second step, I think, is the need, and this gets to Catherine's point about global solutions. Now, why is that? So if we look back at history, economic growth and prosperity have actually come largely from the use of fossil fuels, but it's been unequal. And this has created enormous inequalities in energy access. But as we know, the whole of the world's population is impacted by climate change. So we're equally affected, but there's huge inequality. Now, if we just step back and ask the question, who's affected? There is 1 billion people today who still live in energy poverty. And there are 2.6 billion that have no access to clean technology and fuels. And many of those are in developed countries. And that problem is going to grow because the current population is 7 billion. It will grow to about 9 billion by 2040. And what comes with that is a 25% increase in energy demand. Now, of course, developed countries have used fossil fuels to drive economic growth. They've also introduced greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. Developed countries also have undeveloped hydrocarbon resources. And the world would then say, yes, you have to leave those alone. That means there's an obligation for everybody to get behind this. And the fact that the developed world has to make interventions and help and support a global solution. The third step, I think, and this is the slightly frightening piece, is the scale of the gap between where we are today and where we need to be. So last year, 84% of the current global energy mix was made up of oil, gas, and coal. Hydropower and nuclear accounted for 11%, and renewables in the form of wind, basically, and solar were at about 5%. Now, if you have a normal transition, we end up with about 14% of the energy mix by 2040 accounted for by renewables. What we actually need is 33% just to limit global temperatures to the range up to 2 degrees. So therefore, if we hit that target of 33%, it still means that 40% of the world's energy is going to come from oil and gas. And the reason for that is that gas is a cleaner alternative, particularly for coal-based power generation, and oil is one of the components to transportation beyond the use of hybrid and electric cars. So we need a range of solutions that deal with greenhouse gas emissions, including what is commonly called carbon capture and sequestration. This is what Catherine was talking about in terms of carbon sinks. And that progress and that technology needs to happen now. And all of these interventions also need to address head on the inefficiency in energy that we have today and the importance of using carbon pricing as a vehicle for driving a different set of behaviors. The fourth step in the journey, I think, is about decarbonizing the transport sector. And there's been a lot of focus by governments and media on vehicle electrification, particularly the use of lithium-ion batteries. And of course, rechargeable batteries are also quite important in terms of storing energy that's produced by solar and wind because of the issue of energy intermittency. Now, this also means we have to address an issue around sustainable lithium and cobalt resources to allow the manufacture of lithium-ion technology. And that means recognizing today that those same resources are actually geographically concentrated in a limited number of countries. So despite the widespread distribution of oil and gas, we have an issue about the distribution of the key resources that will drive this revolution. And that lithium demand will increase by about 300% in the next 10 to 15 years. So you then have a supply chain issue that we need to seriously look at and address. And I'll give you an example of that. 40% of the world's lithium batteries come from China, and 70% of them are created using a manufacturing process that use electricity generated by coal-fired power stations. We also need alternatives to electric battery powertrains because not all of the transport sector can use this technology, particularly heavy machinery, heavy road haulage, merchant ships, and of course the aviation sector. Now, there are a couple of solutions that are evolving, and they've been evolving very rapidly in the last 2 years. The first one is biofuels. Now, what this means is premium quality fuels for both haulage and for aviation that are produced from basically raw materials, renewable raw materials, where the process of growing the product basically takes in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and the net impact versus existing fuel systems is an 80 to 90% reduction in net emissions. The second one, which I personally think is one of the keys to the future beyond electric vehicles, is hydrogen. Because it's got a lot of similarities actually in performance to and consumer experience to existing fossil fuel cars, particularly for cars, light and heavy vehicles, but it also has, as we will see, a real impact on potential for the long haul aviation sector beyond sustainable fuels. And what we've seen in the last 18 to 24 months is a massive increase in joint industry and government programs and broader commitments by the European Union on making further inroads into commitments for hydrogen technology for a whole range of sectors. And as Catherine said, we've got to think about the impacts on employment. So hydrogen technologies have the potential to provide about 18% of the world's total energy needs. And they will also create significant numbers of jobs globally in a market that is 2.5 trillion US dollars. The fifth step is to address how we meet the energy requirements from electricity. And that does mean doubling the size of our electricity capacity right now, which of course is dominantly produced by fossil fuels, so that we get to 2050 with about a 41% mix. And that's all about solar, and it's all about wind. And it does require investments in grids and flexibility and vehicle to grid storage. But it also triggers a major demand for land access to accommodate wind and solar farms and all the infrastructure. But it also raises challenge on the socio-economic impacts of solar and wind on rural and town populations. Now, some of these limitations are going to be addressed, I have no doubt, by putting wind and solar offshore, believe it or not. So the final piece of the puzzle, and drawing this to a close, is how do we fund this transition? So if we look at the investment to achieve the target of net zero by 2050, it hasn't been put in place today, despite the fact that over 60 countries are endorsing the policy to deliver net zero. And to be effective, realistically, policies have to be funded, or at least the funding mix has to be realized, because the private sector is not able to deliver the energy transition alone. And the reason is this: we have reduced the dependence on fossil fuels by 3% over the last 2 years, after the last 20 years, despite advances in renewable technology, and they're certainly becoming cheaper, at a total investment of 2 trillion US dollars. So if you do the maths, you are looking for some significant amounts of money to go into this. And realistically, for any private company, investment in the energy transition means making sufficient returns from existing assets, funding future investments, meeting debt and internal pension obligations, and then at the same time delivering competitive dividend returns to shareholders, many of whom are institutions that, as Catherine said, support global pension funds. There needs to be a change in the operating model. Now, that growth is unlikely to come from the alternative energy sector. And the reason is it's because it's fragmented. Certainly the startups which are producing alternative energy solutions are small, and the bigger players, there's very few of the large scale players that have the capacity to spread investments across multiple low carbon technologies and across different geographies. Now, this is where potentially the bigger multinational oil companies come in terms of developing integrated solutions. And the reason for that is that their capacity in terms of finance is an order of magnitude, if not 2 orders of magnitude, bigger than most power and utility companies. The key question will be, beyond their technical capabilities of what they can do, and they can certainly be involved in this, the key question is how will markets set the expectations on their financial returns, and how will we value them? And so to end, if beyond these kind of investments, if capital markets are unable to fund the energy transition, we need to have additional options in place in the form of government policies and regulatory frameworks that allow public sector investment. And that financial model is likely to become a public-private partnership in which capital is made available despite the low commercial returns at the present, in order to garner the societal benefit. Anya, back to you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. That was sobering, the sobering 6 steps, I would say, but very interesting that both you and Catherine identified public-private partnerships as key, and that might come up in our discussion afterwards. Thank you very much for a really fascinating talk. I'm going to now introduce Madeleine Rawlins, another of our illustrious alums from Newcastle. Madeleine is a principal consultant at Mott MacDonald, which is a global engineering, management, and development consultancy company. It employs 16,000 people around the world, and it has an office in Newcastle upon Tyne, I've recently learned. Madeleine graduated from Newcastle University in 1997 with a BSc in chemistry. And she is responsible for Mott MacDonald's Climate Resilience Initiative. She's also chair of the board of the Climate Markets and Investment Association, which is an independent non-for-profit organization providing leadership from the private sector on the delivery of climate policies. So over to you, Madeleine.
Thanks, Anya. I just wanted also to add to that. I've been working in climate change for over 20 years now, and after graduating from Newcastle, I decided to study climate change policy as part of my master's. Basically, the year the Kyoto Protocol was signed, and I've been quite passionate ever since about increasing ambition on climate change, and I've been working in the international climate policy environment. One of the things, the thing I want to talk about today, though, having worked in policy for such a long number of years, one of the things that I got most excited about recently was the response of the global financial sector in terms of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which was set up in 2015 by Mark Carney, and the impact that has had in terms of dealing with climate change risks. In particular, it has had a major influence over global divestments and the stranded assets that Catherine has referred to. But it's also affecting how companies such as mine, Mott MacDonald, responds to climate change. It perhaps doesn't close that question that Marcus posed around where the money is going to come from to actually invest in all this green infrastructure. So just to give you a little bit of background on this task force, it was in 2015 that Mark Carney spoke at Lloyd's of London about the threat posed by climate change risks to insurers, financial stability, and the global economy. And in fact, failure to act on climate change and extreme weather have consistently been identified in the top 5 risks from the World Economic Forum since then, and they are the top 2 risks in 2019 and in 2020. So this is really escalated to the top of that agenda. In his speech, he basically identified 3 main risks to financial stability. The first is what Catherine and Marcus have been talking about, the transition required to achieve a low carbon economy and how that will prompt the reassessment and value of assets. The second risk was the litigation risks for emitters arising from claims from parties who suffered loss and damage from climate change. And then also the physical risks that impact insurance liabilities and the value of assets. So in response to that speech, the G20 established this task force on climate-related financial disclosure, which has essentially set out a set of recommendations, voluntary recommendations for the financial sector and some major industries to look at how they assess climate risks within their business. They're being asked to report what their material risks are that are associated with climate change, how they're embedding climate change into their governance, their business, their strategy and financial planning, how they integrate climate change into overall company risk management processes, and what are the targets and metrics that they're using to manage the company's performance against that. Also key to these recommendations was the need for companies to look at long-term climate scenarios and assess how their business strategies are resilient to longer-term risks, and in particular, whether or not their investments are aligned to the goals of the Paris Agreement, that 2-degree or even the 1.5-degree emissions pathway. So around the world, these recommendations are being quite widely adopted, certainly in the financial sector, also by governments, and in some countries it is already mandatory to disclose against these recommendations. In Japan and France, and now also in the UK, we talked about pension funds already. The UK is the first country to make TCFD reporting mandatory for pension funds. It's likely also to be mandatory for listed companies in the UK, and there is an expectation that it will become mandatory across financial and non-financial industries in the next 2 years. Internationally, also the UK is seeking to take some leadership on this and persuade many more countries to do the same and make this make the implementation of these recommendations mandatory. And it is actually a key theme for the international climate change negotiations in the UK next year. So it's difficult to say exactly what the impact has been, but it certainly has strengthened the movement to divest from fossil fuels and get financial institutions to reassess their portfolios and realign their capital towards greener projects. The disclosure has increased pressure on institutional investors, but that's also going down to the companies that they invest in. Institutional investors with around 15 trillion under management have already committed to divest from fossil fuels. And at the same time, insurance companies have stopped providing insurance, particularly to coal assets. So there has been a major shift in the investment and insurance sector. From Mott MacDonald's perspective, we've seen climate risks as a key issue for our business for some time. And as Anya mentioned, I've been sitting within a strategic initiative on climate resilience, looking at how we embed climate risks into our business. And as of this year, we are now asking our project managers to start assessing climate risks on our projects. We've set a target that we'll do this on all of our major projects within 2 years and all of our projects within 4. So in order to achieve this, we're building our own internal capacity and training all of our staff, all of our project staff. And again, as Anya mentioned, we have 16,000 people around the world. So this is quite an enormous task for us. We've also committed ourselves to reporting against the recommendations, even though we're not required to do so, because we do believe that this will strengthen our business and support a much more sustainable growth strategy for us. I should also mention that a few years ago, there was also, as a result of these recommendations, a call for professional bodies to embed climate change into the qualification and practice of members. And so I do see this becoming far more mainstreamed in the engineering sector, even though those recommendations were very much pointed at the financial sector. And that's all. Thanks. Back to Anya.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Madeline. It's fascinating to hear about the effects on the delivery of major projects, both of the climate change risk itself and effectively the risk of not complying with the way the world has decided to address the challenge. I think those are, there are two separate things, aren't they? But both absolutely critical. I'm very sorry to report that we seem to have lost Professor Phil Blythe from the connection, so I won't be able to introduce him and hand over to him, but it's possible he'll reconnect with us as we go on. So what I would like to do now is thank again very much our panelists for their views and open the floor to all of you listening to questions. And I do have some questions that have come through in the chat box. So I'll start with a question from Christine, which isn't directed at any one of you in particular, but is obviously something that's on all of our minds at the moment. Is in what way is the present state of climate change linked to this pandemic and to possible future ones? We heard from David Graham a little bit earlier in his public lecture on this Alumni Day about the likelihood of future pandemics and the fact that we do need to be prepared for other pandemics, in ones that might in fact be going on silently at the moment. So would anyone like to take up that question? Just wave at me if you would like to. In what way is the present state of climate change? Marcus, yeah, and Catherine.
That's a great question. And for those who haven't seen it, there was a recent documentary by David Attenborough that actually addressed this issue and was probably one of the most powerful expressions of the linkages between what we do and the impact on the environment. And what it was basically saying was that as we continue to deforest, as we continue to release CO2 into the atmosphere and a variety of other more nasty things like methane and nitrous oxide, we are encroaching on places that have natural diseases and breaking down the links in terms of disease control, which is triggering these events with a greater frequency. And, you know, if you look at, certainly in my experience, although I wasn't around in the Spanish flu period, you know, recently, back in 2016, we had the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which is actually a COVID virus. We have the COVID-19 virus today. And if you trace all of those back to the source of the problem is fundamentally encroaching on environments, encroaching on particular regions and collapsing down the environment that animals and species can live in, but also the knock-on effects of that of communication. And it's a very powerful representation of why it's important to use actually COVID as the springboard for a transition. And I, you know, work for Support Boston Consulting in the Middle East and Far East, and there is a massive amount of work going on through energy companies to really address this issue and to move away from certainly recognizing the need for fossil fuels in some way, but developing the technologies, but at the same time shifting away because they recognize all of these interdependent effects.
Thank you. Catherine, thank you very much, Marcus. Catherine, would you like to say something as well to address the question? Thanks.
Yes, I can, just really emphasize what Marcus said in terms of the pandemic and the potential for future pandemics. As we're approaching especially 1.5 degree threshold and especially the 2 degree threshold, we're looking at runaway climate change. And this means that most of the permafrost in northern Russia around Siberia is thawing, also northern Canada. And we don't know what's frozen there. But what we do know and what early studies have shown, there are all kinds of viruses and bacteria there that have a very strong potential to cause future global pandemics. And also a similar phenomenon around especially the Brazilian and other rainforests. And as humans are further approaching into areas where wildlife has been able to live undisturbed, we're looking at an increased risk of further spread. So there is a very close and direct link between climate change and one impact of climate change being not just natural disasters, but also disasters on human health. And what we have seen with the current COVID-19 crisis is it has massive social impacts, especially the reactions to that. Trying to address the health crisis means making social and economic crises a reality, potential implications for financial system stability, and especially countries' financial capabilities to address and invest in climate change mitigation and adaptation. So what we need is something that brings things together, especially around the sustainable development goals and thinking about all those different sub-goals to really focus on a long-term economic, social, and environmental transition into the second part of the 21st century. So to continue with the policies and especially to combine economic recovery from COVID with addressing climate change in more of a win-win scenario and not ending up in those win-lose trade-offs that we have often seen over the previous decades.
Thank you, Catherine. Madeline wanted to add something.
Yeah, so just to give a slightly different perspective, I currently sit within Mott MacDonald in the International Development Unit, and we're working on many international programs. That one direct impact of the pandemic has been that the UK is committed to 0.7% of GNP to be spent on overseas development assistance. And what we've seen actually is most where they're making cuts because the economy has shrunk, the cuts have not been around climate change. And in fact, the UK has doubled its commitment on climate change finance to developing countries from 5.8 to 11.6 billion. The World Bank has done the same. They've doubled their commitment from 100 billion to 200 billion. And people like the Asian Development Bank have said that by 2030, 75% of their operations will be centered on climate change. So that speaks to that public investment in climate change around the world. And we're not seeing any change there. And in fact, climate change has become an even bigger priority. And in some cases as well, we've seen that, for example, in Canada, their response has also looked at the TCFD and how that relates to the pandemic. And they've said that anyone in receipt of bailouts will have to disclose their climate risk in order to receive that, and things like that. So these things are getting tied together to make sure that, you know, the capital that is available is being directed in the right place. And then on the other side, I think it's really important to note that, you know, we've shown, certainly in the UK, that we haven't been very resilient. We didn't have the right emergency planning in place. And we need that for the pandemics, we need that for climate change. And we need to really bring all of these things together and have a much stronger response to these risks.
Thank you very much, Madeline. The questions are coming through sort of thick and fast in the chat. So I'll move on to the next one, which is from Marta from Catalonia, who asks, how are climate change future policies going to enable jobs creation? And that's not directed at anybody in particular, so I don't know who would like to leap in to address that. How will jobs be created? Okay, Catherine, yeah.
Thank you. That's a very important question, and I think a lot on people's minds. So we will see that a certain number of jobs, especially around the fossil fuel industry in the wider sense, are going to disappear. But there are thousands, millions of green jobs going to be created by the zero carbon or low carbon transition. So it's a lot around new technologies, artificial intelligence, smart grids, smart cities, smart transport, smart everything, literally, smart homes. And also around inventing new technologies and, well, producing them, bringing them to market, implementing them. There will also be a lot of jobs around just home insulation, for example, or upgrading homes to, for example, replace gas heating with biomass heating, for example. Wood chip pellets are a good substitute for oil or gas powered homes. And all kinds of home installations, solar panel, PV installations. So especially around kind of trade related jobs and vocational training jobs, there will be a lot of local economy support and creation. And many things can just simply, people who have already been trained in a certain vocation or profession, they can essentially just continue doing that with a little bit of additional learning around applying those newer, cleaner technologies and approaches. But some of them will require more substantial retraining. So we will have to put a strong emphasis on giving people the opportunity at some point in their career to actually go back to vocational training, to university, to actually acquire the skills they will need to continue to participate and to re-engage with the new green economy that is being created.
Thank you. Yes, Marcus, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just to build on Catherine's comments. One of the things that always surprises me is people's belief about the skills in the oil and gas sector. We've done things that go way beyond landing a man on a moon when it comes to applying technology. And this gets back to Madeline's point about engineering. And those engineering skills are actually transferable. Now, let me give you a few examples. So today, we obviously pump oil and gas out of the North Sea in the United Kingdom. and we use a whole range of technologies, and we drive cost efficiency through using augmented reality, artificial intelligence, cognitive learning, and a whole range of different things that you might think the oil and gas sector doesn't use. It's actually driving much better energy efficiency. It's driving methane detection and a whole variety of things. But if I then translate that to 10, 15 years time, there is a program in place which is being championed by the Oil and Gas Authority in the UK, which will turn the North Sea Basin not into an oil and gas basin anymore, but actually into an energy basin, where you can use the infrastructure that you have today, use the technology that we have for subsea exploration and development, but you turn it into subsea technology for moving basically hydrogen around, not methane. You use wind engineering and turbines to create basically the capability for hydrolysis, which allows you to create hydrogen rather. And that goes into power grids onshore, and the whole process is shifting, and it's being considered in a whole range of areas. So this whole debate, for example, that Catherine mentioned, which is a really important debate, you know, who wants a wind turbine in their back garden? Well, the answer is not a lot of people based on planning requirements. The flip side of that is if you place that technology offshore, and the sorts of technology required are actually very similar, and they're adjacent to the technologies that the oil and gas business uses. And I think both the oilfield services sector, which is the one that supports the oil and gas sector, has cottoned onto this in a very big way. And so they see it as skills translation rather than lots of jobs being lost. And I think, you know, one of the things that I talked about, energy transparency, I think there's a lot of transparency that's needed around what skills really are there and whether they're translatable. Because my sense is, you know, having moved from life from being a geologist very shortly to then being a reservoir engineer, then to being a business person and going to Harvard, I've learned skills along the way. And I might be older, but I do believe that we all have the capacity, particularly engineering, to make the switch, because a lot of the technology that's coming out today is digital technology. And I talk to very young people in a whole range of national oil companies and international oil companies, and they are so keen, one, about the energy transition, which is fantastic because we need this momentum. But secondly, the use of digital is just phenomenal. It's just opening up lots of opportunities. So I think rather than talking about losing jobs, I think it's a matter about shifting the focus of what they do and their technical skills into something that will make a big difference.
Madeline.
Yeah, I would only add that there's also a huge skills gap and in terms of climate change at the moment. And, you know, we're talking about how the need to train, you know, so the volume of people that need to be trained in this area is enormous. If we're assessing climate change on all of the projects that we implement, there's a huge opportunity even just within that space. And we're seeing a lot of people moving from, for example, engineering companies into the financial sector. Just they pay better, and what skills there are in the market are getting sucked up by the financial sector because they need to respond to these emerging risks.
Thank you. As I said, there's so many questions. I'm finding it difficult to choose, so I am just going in order. Some of them are directed for particulars of you, and but one question is interesting with respect to innovation. Why and how would hydrocarbon oil major giants be more successful drivers on new low carbon technologies than new innovators, when historically it's incumbents with the dominant technology who are rarely the businesses that create new technologies?
What a great question.
And that's from Bruce Tozer, pardon me if I pronounce it wrong. And there's a second question that comes from him, but it's I'll let you answer the first.
Okay, it's a great question because I think there are other forces afoot that will cause the bigger oil and gas companies to rethink the way they operate, because they have been relatively safe up until now. But there's a couple of things happening. The first thing is, and this is all about financial markets. The reality is that to transition, the dividend yields from these companies has got to come down in order to pay for the transition. They've got to be much more efficient. And they also realize that they're missing skills in alternative energy. Now, some of them, and I would say Repsol as an example, has moved out in front. Shell has done that. And of course, BP, as many people know, has sort of leapfrogged everybody in terms of commitments, not in terms of sort of actions. I think there's a recognition here that there are two things going on. Most of the alternative energy is developed by smaller companies and startups looking at different things. And therefore, if you're going to change a global problem, you have to have a global connectivity, and that means scale. And so one of the things, if international oil companies are going to be successful, is to be open enough to accept that the skills that they have are transferable, but the operating models have to be different because the margins are different. They're not the sorts of returns that you would normally get. Now, what's happened in the financial markets is people are saying, well, since clearly oil and gas is not a long-term investment anymore, the only thing we can rely on is your dividend. And that's a very different world than we used to have, which is these guys are always returning 10, 12, 15% rate of returns. We actually believe that's not the case anymore. So they're all shifting. And I think the clever bit here is that they have to take over companies and run them as they would as if they were a startup. In other words, these are growth agendas. And a couple of examples I'm aware of. So if you look at BP, when I was at BP, we had a solar business division, and it was very much about manufacturing solar and providing alternative energy. They have done it in a completely different way now through a company called Lightsource BP, where they own the whole process, but they're using people who have come from that sector. So what I think is going to happen is that the energy companies will say, if somebody's really good at doing something, then they will help and support that growing, but they will apply their business model, not the model of the past. Because, you know, as Madeline will know, the engineering capabilities of what we've had to do over the last 50 years have been absolutely enormous. But the reality is we're not dealing with complex movements of hydrocarbons from A to B. We're actually building electrical circuits and power systems and wind turbines. And it's a much simpler way of thinking about things. And that requires a different business model. So the big issue is going to be not whether they can grow, it's whether they can behave in an agile way for a future whose technology is dominated outside the oil and gas sector.
So picking up on the question of funding, we have a couple of other questions on funding, which I just lost it. For example, do you think the funding solutions that have been suggested, for example, public-private partnerships, will be able to provide the funding needed to tackle these issues anytime in the near future? Or are other solutions such as investment banking focused on funding sustainable businesses possible on a large scale? I don't know whether, Madeline, since you talked a little bit about recent public investments, whether that was something that falls in your domain or whether anybody else would like to tackle that in terms of.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to think. Can you repeat the second part
Well,
of the question?
I think the second part of the question was, what are the other solutions for, are other solutions such as investment banking that's focused on sustainable businesses? Will these translate up to the large scale needed for the funding that's needed to tackle the problem? Or what other funding solutions might there be to tackle this major issue?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's, from a standards perspective, there is an awful lot of work happening at the moment on green bonds and sustainable finance and taxonomies for green investments, essentially so that there's much more transparency over how companies are investing. And I think that work in itself is driving a lot of investment behavior. And if people are going to have their investments classified as green or not green, then that's going to have a major impact, and it is already. And we're seeing that happening in the EU. They have a sustainable finance initiative, and it's being adopted on the stock exchanges around Europe. So that will have an impact.
Yeah, thank you. I want to get through a few more of the questions, especially there are a few that have been directed to individuals. This is and I'm sorry, that was from Catherine Hurwitz, and this is a question for Marcus, which is from Georgios Zervakis. And you mentioned that a big percentage of fuel emissions is caused by server farms, cloud infrastructure. So what's your view on the recent experiment of Microsoft that placed part of their data centers in the sea to achieve passive cooling of the hardware? Would this have consequences to life under the sea?
Wow.
Yes.
I thought you were going to say something else, actually.
Yeah, well, you could answer the thing I didn't ask then.
Well, it's actually about the question, because I think there's a recognition by the big players. If you look at Microsoft, or if you look at Amazon Web Services, you know, a lot of their current electricity demand is met by fossil fuels. And as an example, BP's just done a deal with, I think it's Amazon Web Services. They're going to provide alternative energy through basically wind generated power to support the server farms at the same time as effectively doing a deal on the provision of cloud computing. In terms of the issue around, of course, cooling servers is that you reduce the resistance. It's an electrical conductivity issue. So solutions like that are helpful. I think that combined with switching the source of electrical power from fossil fuels into alternative energy is possible, because if you look at the US today, if you just put politics aside for a second, given the current environment, you know, there's huge, large tracts of land which you can use for wind power. You can also use it for solar power. And we already have examples in the Middle East where we have solar panels in water, because it's a space that people can use. We've also got examples, and progressively will be a big play in the North Sea of the UK, and in fact in Norway, all the way around in through to Poland, which is offshore wind energy. So, you know, this is available, and therefore connecting up with cloud computing and server farms, which take up huge amounts of space, you know, is the way forward. But yes, of course, you know, cooling something down, of course, basically improves the electricity demand. Mm-hmm. I hope that answers the question.
Well, it's yes, it has. Thank you. I have a question for Catherine here. This is from David Golding. Lord Deben reported in 2019 that of 25 of the CCC's recommendations in 2018, the government had actioned only one. David Golding has been inquiring about the possibility of legal action to address this. Do you have any comments?
So, well, climate litigation is actually becoming increasingly important, and it's part of holding government to account, really. So government, not just the UK, but governments in general, they're coming up with their nationally determined contributions, all kinds of commitments, plans to set up legislation. In many aspects, they're actually legislating, but then in the end, it actually has to be held to account. It has to be ensured that those pieces of legislation, regulations, policies, that are actually being implemented. And this is one massive challenge we see. A lot of countries have quickly stepped up towards signing the Paris Agreement and come up with more or less ambitious plans to implement it. But now we see the real challenge. And this is also where the real economic and social costs actually are of actually implementing policies. And especially as government shifts, commitments rise and especially fall. So climate litigation and holding government to account is an absolute key element. And we see more and more of that happening across the UK and also across the world.
Thank you very much. So we have a question from Peter Langley, a specific question and phrasing it more generally. So to what extent do you think that increasing biofuel production will impact on land use, loss of biodiversity, and increasing agricultural CO2 production? All of that would mitigate the beneficial effects of the biofuel itself. So more generally, he says, what will the impact of risk be on climate solutions which cause other major problems and then reduce the benefit of those solutions? Is that either specifically about biofuels and the loss of biodiversity, or the more general form of the question, something that one of you.
I'm going to pick up on the biofuels question, because it's a great question. I think there's two ways into this. The first one is obviously using waste oil, and I'm talking about cooking oil and related biomass, which there are a number of companies who now make sustainable both aviation fuel and renewable diesel. And there you're actually taking something that has already been used as a product. It's grown for one purpose, but then it's repurposed for another. Another example would be plastics as well, by the way, and the circular economy. When it comes to growing effectively biomass and absorbing it, clearly this is why I said, I think in the conversation, that this is a transition solution. It isn't the final solution because of exactly the issues we're talking about. And the biggest example of the largest example you can talk about it and put it in context is the whole issue of beef and Brazil. Large tracts of land converted to provide food, and that's having a massive impact on the Amazon rainforest. And where it's done selectively, I think, and where it's controlled, is fine. The problem is the scale that you have to go to, and I think that's one of the biggest issues. There's a company called Neste, and I'm not trying to do an advert for them, but they have transitioned from being a international oil and gas company, effectively with downstream refining, into the world of biofuels, and they've basically connected up the whole market from McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken and all these people who create basically mass oil that's produced as a waste product, and they're converting it back into biofuels. And the fascinating thing about it is that fuel has no aromatics and it doesn't have particulates like a normal kerosene. So it's better for the environment, and you're reusing the product. And I think this repossessing or repurposing things is the way for the future. But as you say, Anya, the issue here is we've really got to start thinking about something that's more sustainable, which is why I think hydrogen will actually leap ahead and take over that particular part of the sector.
Yeah, and I think the second part of that question was around how the way we use our land also then affects our ability to cope with the impacts of climate change, I suppose, was that the second part. So thinking about how potentially our forests support the water cycle, how areas of drought might be created, how they protect us from flooding, and all of those important considerations as well. And just generally nature-based solutions and how we use our ecosystems to provide us with protection from climate change.
Thank you. I think we're supposed to close about now, but as we started late, I do want to just throw in perhaps two more questions if we could. I think one of them strikes me as particularly important, especially given that Newcastle is focused on the world. And this question comes from Husseini Musa. Fighting climate change in poor countries, especially in Africa, seems impossible or will require more time, considering that significant numbers of people live below the poverty line. What are the recommendations for such countries if they are to move at the same pace with the rest of the world in fighting climate change? Catherine.
It's a very important question. It affects Africa, it affects many parts of Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and also Latin America. And the answer is it really has to be integrated with the Sustainable Development Goals, and we really have to think holistically. Climate action is one of the SDGs, but poverty alleviation related targets are equally important. And the solution or the response to that is poor developing countries, least developed countries as a category, which also includes a lot of small island states, they don't have the same responsibilities as developed countries have to address climate change. For them, it's more about adaptation to the climate change impact so that people can actually remain in their countries and their regions so they don't have to migrate elsewhere just to survive. And especially around clean, low carbon development. So they're adding a lot of new infrastructure around roads, rail, air traffic is still increasing around heating, cooking, cooling technologies around the home. So it's about leapfrogging technologies, not repeating the fossil fuel heavy mistakes of the developed countries, but there are clean technologies available. And it's about using renewable energies instead of fossil fuels, for example. And that also has a lot of advantages around other sustainable development goals to reduce especially air emissions and really improving people's quality of life. And a very important element to that is technology transfer, especially also around intellectual properties, and also capacity building. So it is the responsibility of the developed countries to facilitate development and to make sure that actually implementing clean solutions is much cheaper for developing countries than using fossil fuels.
Thank you, Catherine. Madeline.
Yeah, and I would just add that this question has always been fundamental to the UN framework on climate change, and the fact that there is this common but differentiated responsibility to act on climate change. So developing countries' actions would necessarily come later. But there's also now within the Paris Agreement a commitment from developed countries to provide $100 billion per year to developing countries. And I think that's already recognised as not enough. And even just if you take adaptation, the UN Environment Programme is looking at more like 300 or 400 billion required on the adaptation side. So I think we'll see that rising as well. But this does get dealt with a lot within those negotiations.
We have one last question from Ron Willis. What are your thoughts on getting out of the current recession via green recovery funding and building back better? Or are our debt levels just too high to fund this? Any takers on that one?
Sounded like the backdrop to the Conservative government's pitch this week.
I think the quotation marks in that question relate to that.
If I can make an observation.
Can we build back better?
Yeah, I think it was interesting that Boris obviously committed to electricity in everybody's homes, and he talked about providing £160 million worth of funding. And my immediate reaction to that was that's a little bit de minimis for what really is required. And I think part of this is it's the broader issue, which you can actually extend to Africa, which is how do you co-sponsor things rather than either government stepping in versus private sector? Because a lot of these solutions are about trying to find the right balance between, people don't like the term, but sustainable capitalism is something we really do need to go back and look at in terms of how we fund these things. And it doesn't matter whether it's in the United Kingdom, where I think we can probably work our way through it, to Africa, where the disparities in wealth are so great. The real issue for me, as I talk with friends, is, but how do I make sure the money gets to the right place? And it probably isn't through governments, with great respect. It is through partnerships with cities and partnerships with towns, so that you can co-fund and you can go and walk up to something and say, I invested in that and we can work together to make a difference, because I think that's the big issue. Now, to answer the question, I do think we should use this COVID experience as a bit of time, since we've all been sitting around. Certainly I live in Scotland, and we seem to go into lockdown on a pretty regular basis. There's a lot of time to think about this very carefully. And also, what are the different operating models that we might want to come up with in terms of how we fund things, how we do things, with the goal of throwing out some targets and then saying, how would we get there, rather than, my worry about policy is it tends to make judgments without it being underpinned by funding. And I think that bringing those things together, but at a local level and building out, might be one of the solutions.
Thank you. Catherine, would you?
If I may add to that, I didn't really have time to go into detail into that in my presentation, but an important win-win element that we can really start focusing on now, more coming out of the COVID crisis, are market-based instruments and putting a price on carbon emissions. So emission trading is a very good example. Some countries have been experimenting with carbon taxes. It essentially means that what we are polluting, we're actually paying for. So we're adding a price tag to that, but it also generates a lot of revenue. So people make decisions often based on financial implications. And if low and zero emission opportunities around transport, energy, all aspects of life, if they're cheaper, people go for that. People often vote with their money, and also around convenience. And this also generates a lot of revenues that can be redistributed towards socially just transitions, towards recovering from the crisis, and instead of adding more debt to existing budgets. So it's like finding an additional revenue and funding stream to fund those sustainable transitions. And of course, adjusting for people in who have little money, they will be mostly affected by those taxes and additional costs. But it's also around redistributing and making sure that people on lower incomes are not disadvantaged, but they're actually having advantages around, for example, subsidies for home insulation, which is a very good example. Germany, for example, has a good initiative around this. If people are replacing their old fossil fuel-based heating with something that has a renewable energy, electricity aspect, they get 45% of those costs covered by the government. And that makes it very competitive and even cheaper towards replacing just existing fossil fuel heating.
I think we're going to have to wrap up now. I don't know, Madeline, if you wanted to leap in with anything summarizing or anything else, please do. Otherwise, I'll...
No, I just think Marcus's point about getting the money to the right place is just so important. And we're working with an international think tank that, you know, have a slogan, money where it matters. There's this huge architecture for international public finance, and it just doesn't necessarily get to the right places sometimes. So I think it's a really, really important point.
Yeah, I think that's extremely important and a good one to close on, because this has been absolutely fascinating, and I feel we could go on all evening. And there are a few questions in the chat box that I haven't been able to get to, so I will endeavour to reply to those outside of this event. One or two were directed to specific speakers about sort of points of detail, so we'll try to make sure that those are answered. But thank you very much to the audience for submitting such really thought-provoking questions. And thank you to our panelists who've done a wonderful, wonderful job laying out the facts, the concerns, the issues, the challenges to the solutions to the major challenge of climate change. And I think we've heard from different sectors, different viewpoints across different domains, and it's really been very stimulating. And I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure that everyone listening has. So huge round of applause from your homes to all of our panelists, and to all of you, our alumni who were listening and taking part. I hope you all have a lovely evening, and join the quiz, which I gather is on later tonight. Thank you again, everybody, and we'll say goodbye. There is a poll in progress now, so do vote for that poll if you see it on your screen.